Hiya, kiddos. All right, so the last time we talked, we were talking about ecology, and we're partway through chapter 3. We'll see how far we get today. So we were talking about speciation. That's the last thing I mentioned. I said all speciation requires what? Isolation. You have to be isolated from another portion, a group of your peoples, so to speak. So when we were talking about those finches, we had said, where'd they come from? They came from the mainland in Ecuador, and some of them got blown out, way out to sea to the Galapagos Islands. That's isolation. So the one group was in the rainforest like they had been for millennia, right? And then the other group were now in these islands, which has a very different ecosystem. They had an ecosystem where it was much drier. And we had said because of this isolation, this was what we called physical isolation. Because of the physical isolation, we called this allopatric speciation. I'd mentioned this really weird thing that oftentimes plants do, and it's called sympatric speciation. And sometimes, just out of through mutations, plants, rather than being diploid, they can become tetraploid. They double their sets of chromosomes. Now, tell me about plants. Plants, in many cases, can fertilize themselves. So if a single individual became tetraploid, they could fertilize themselves and make a lot of individuals. And then maybe over there somewhere, another individual did the same thing and made a whole bunch of them, and they kind of grew together, and then they were cross-pollinating, and there was no isolation. So this became a new plant species. But then what about those that were diploid? They couldn't cross with each other because a diploid with a tetraploid, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So the diploid with the tetraploid, even though they're in the same field, one right here and the other right there, even though they're in the same geographic location, they're isolated because they're genetically incompatible. So this is a type of isolation without geographic isolation. It's a genetic isolation. And then you can have other kinds of isolations, like maybe behavioral. We have things like fireflies. You ever wonder why they do that? It's not to entertain little kids. You know, fireflies light up in June, and kids love them. They go, oh, there's one. How do I know where it is? It just flashed its light. Well, they're not doing it for the kids. They're doing it because they're looking for a hubby. They're looking for a mate. And so it's the way they flash. You know, you say, oh, that one, that one's not flashing right. I'm not going anywhere near that one. But look at her. Woohoo! She's flashing perfectly. And so this would be a case of behaviors isolating without geographic isolation. We had said in both of those cases, whether it's the plant genetic isolation or this behavioral or physical kinds of isolations, that would be something called sympatric speciation. Okay, so I just reviewed slide, well, I don't know what number it was, but it was the last slide that I covered last time. So we have a idea, we have a concept that is called, no two species, I'll think of the name of it, competitive exclusion principle. Whatever. A competitive exclusion principle says that no two species can occupy the same niche. So you've got these species, and they're trying to use different resources in the ecosystem, right? And so maybe, this one's using this part and this one's using this part, and They have a shared area, a shared resource that they're wanting to use. Well, what happens is it ends up, because there's that competition between those individuals that are sharing, they die out. And so we end up making the two species have narrower niches. And so this is what we call disruptive selection. So here's where we have two niches, two species, a blue species and a red species, and where they're competing, they don't do so well. Neither species does so well, and so in the end, you end up with the two species ending up sharing the resource where they don't use, there is no portion of the resource that both species is using. And this is what we call disruptive selection. Okay, next slide. What about if the world changes? We're seeing this right now. I can guarantee you the world is warming up. And so even though a species would be perfectly adapted for this temperature, if the temperature rises, then a portion of the species would do better than the other, and so they change. When we talk about speciation, we're talking about the range and the number of different kinds of genotypes in the population. And so when the environment changes, a different subset of the population are the ones that are just right for the environmental conditions. And so now then those individuals, those that used to be kind of marginal, those individuals are now the ones that are just right. And so even though their genes used to be present in a small concentration, all of a sudden they do really well. And so the population as a whole changes. You change the gene frequency of some of the genes in the population. So you're selecting for a different subset of the population, and over time, the species changes. You know, it used to be we had some of those, woolly horned individuals, but now we have don't have horns and we have short hair because we live in a hot climate, and it used to be much colder. So that's directional selection, and it's driven by a change in the environment. Now, what if you live and are found in a location where it's absolutely the same every day, hot and rainy every day? Where do we see that? Tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest is hot and rainy every day of the year. Christmas, 4th of July, it doesn't matter. They're on the equator. It's always hot. It's always rainy. So it ends up, we have this wide range originally of characteristics, but nothing changes. So those outliers, the individuals in the population that aren't perfectly adapted, they tend to die out. And so you get what we call stabilizing selection, where we have a really uniform, you can see normally if you had this wide range of characteristics, under stabilizing selection, you get a narrower range of selection of characteristics. So it ends up, because of that, we see a lot of habitat partitioning in the tropical rainforest, to the point where you have many different species using, umbrella cockatoos, to give you an example. It's a big white bird that has a big white crest. It's only found on one island in the tropical rainforest, and only on like half of this one island. It's because we have a large number of species, but not many of each one. So we have, so these are different kinds of selection. Selection is from the environment. Okay, next topic. Next topic has to do with taxonomy. And look at this fella. He's a nice looking guy. He was one of my advisors when I was in graduate school. And he was what you call a taxonomist. His name's Merrill Sweet. Looked a little bit like a dwarf. He's an interesting guy, really nice guy. But he was sort of shaped like a dwarf. And he loved, you know what he loved? Stink bugs. Yeah, no kidding. His whole world was stink bugs. And there are people out there who are specialists in certain kinds of living creatures. In his case, it's those stink bugs. I don't like those things. But anyway, he loved them. And so what you do as a taxonomist is you go out and you look to see if you find a stink bug that no one has ever found before. That's the best thing you can do. And you know what you do? When you find that animal that has never been, or plant, that has never been seen before, what you do is you write a scientific paper and you name it. Mm-hmm. And so that's what Merrill Sweet would do. So how do you know if this is a new one? You catch one of them stink bugs and you say, I don't think this is one that we've ever seen before, that no one has ever described. How do you know it? You go to the museums. So it ends up, what taxonomists do is when they find a new species, they say, they'll take one individual. They say, this is the quintessential kind of, whatever new stink bug it was. This is the one. And this is the type specimen. And then you say, but we got all these other ones. And so what they do is you kill them. You put them on a pin and you put it in a museum. And you put a whole bunch of, you say, well, these are the variations that we see. So you have a whole bunch of the other individuals. And so if he is looking for a new stink bug, he goes to museums and looks at their collection. And he says, by golly, it's new. And he gets to describe it, writes all the details about it, and gets credit for it and names it. Okay, so it's a pretty big deal to have the type specimen. Do you know, down in Pittsburgh, dinosaurs, they do the same thing. And you know what a T-Rex is? Of course you do. Everyone knows what a Tyrannosaurus Rex is. It's the most famous dinosaur there is. Guess what? At the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, they have that quintessential perfect individual of T-Rex. They have the type specimen. They're on display. You can go see it. You can get within inches of it to see it. Now, if you start touching it or crawling on it, they're not going to allow that. So anyway, that is what a taxonomist does. They try to pigeonhole life. So they'll say that this one, so they try to figure out who's related to each other too. They say, well, this one is kind of like a cousin, and this is similar, but it's really different. So it'd be like distant relations. And so they developed this classification scheme for different species. So anyway, and so that's what a taxonomist does. And that's a good friend of mine. I haven't seen him in years, but he was a really cool guy. And now you know the story of Merrill Sweet. He was at Texas A&M. He's retired now. Hopefully he's still alive. I don't have any idea. All right, I'm going to stop here. I see we've gone 14 minutes. Yikes. I'll come back with another one of these little videos.